On October 17, 1997, a confidential tip was received by Sheriff Thomas Wilkins, a connection that would forever change the tranquil Oregon interior city of Oak Ridge. The complaint, lodged by a neighbor who chose to remain anonymous, spoke of strange noises emanating from an isolated property. This land belonged to the Blackwood family, who had been established in that mountainous region since the middle of the 19th century. "Something's wrong inside that barn. I've never seen anyone enter or leave, but sometimes I hear screams at night. They aren't animal sounds," stated the call recording, which is still preserved in the Lane County Police Archives. What authorities discovered at the Blackwood farm, situated about 40 kilometers from the Oak Ridge Center, surpassed all expectations. Hidden by dense vegetation and encircled by a barbed wire fence nearly 3 meters high, stood a faded red barn. From a distance, it seemed typical, but its only entrance was secured with multiple chains, locks, and padlocks. As officers forced the door open, the stench was the immediate assault, a blend of feces, urine, and something undefinable. One police officer would later describe it as the smell of the very absence of humanity. Inside, where light barely penetrated through cracks in the roof, they found 7 women. Their ages ranged from 12 to 42 years, and they were living in conditions that the official police report later deemed incompatible with any standard of human dignity. Dr. Michael Stevenson, a coroner who participated in the operation, told the Portland Herald, "I was shocked. In 27 years of medical practice, I've never witnessed anything remotely like it. These women displayed physical traits that immediately suggested severe consanguinity and prolonged inbreeding, facial malformations, extra fingers, and apparent vision difficulties. But their eyes were the most unsettling feature, all shared the identical, vacant look." Subsequent inquiries would reveal that the barn contained more than just victims. It housed a generational experiment in family endogamy that had spanned at least 5 generations. Genetic records analyzed at the University of Oregon would later confirm these women were possibly the most consanguineous ever documented in the modern history of the United States. The property was legally owned by Jeremiah Blackwood, then 68, the patriarch of a family that had become increasingly isolated from the community over the decades. What began as simple social withdrawal eventually culminated in one of the most disturbing, documented narratives of intentional genetic manipulation, abuse, and isolation. The initial investigation indicated that 4 of the 7 women were Jeremiah's biological daughters, while the remaining 3 were the offspring of unions between his own children over the years. According to later calculations by geneticists at the University of Washington, the coefficient of consanguinity for some of them reached values near 0.375, figures rarely observed outside of extremely isolated populations. "This wasn't an accident or a case of ignorance," explained Dr. Eliza Montgomery, the forensic geneticist leading the case. "We discovered detailed diaries that explicitly demonstrated a deliberate intention to create what they termed a pure lineage. There were notes on specific physical characteristics, attempts to select traits like bone structure and eye color through planned near-relative crossings." The Blackwood case not only horrified the small local community but also sparked renewed debate regarding the limits of family privacy, community surveillance, and rural isolation in remote parts of the U.S. The Blackwood family history of isolation. The Blackwood family's history dates back to the Great Depression, when Elijah Blackwood, Jeremiah's grandfather, purchased the 200-acre property in 1931 for only a fraction of its true value. Original Lane County documents show that Elijah, a former miner who lost everything in the economic downturn, paid a mere $175 for the land, a value considered extremely low even at that time. The reason for the low price, according to local historical archives, was the property's sinister reputation. In 1924, the previous owner, John Wickman, had murdered his entire family before committing suicide. Since then, no one had been interested in the land. This event, though seemingly unconnected to the Blackwood saga, established a pattern of superstition and isolation that would ultimately shape the family's destiny. Elijah Blackwood arrived with his wife, Martha, and 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. Preserved school records from the Oak Ridge Municipal Library indicate the children attended the local school for just 1 year before being removed for home education. The official school dismissal document, dated 1933, includes an observation from the director at the time: family exhibits extreme, non-conforming behavior. Children demonstrate age-appropriate knowledge but avoid contact with other students. The family seldom ventured into the city, making only 2 or 3 annual trips to purchase goods they couldn't produce. A diary kept by the local warehouse owner from 1935 to 1940, now in the Oak Ridge Historical Museum, records: "The Blackwoods came today. As usual, the old man did the shopping while the children and Mrs. B stayed in the car. No one in that family ever smiles. They bought unusual quantities of ammunition and kerosene. Something about them doesn't seem right." During World War II, when recruitment agents visited the property in 1943, they were met with armed resistance. Police records from that period state that Elijah threatened the officers with a shotgun, declaring that no Blackwood would spill blood for a government that only remembers men when it needs them to die. For reasons that the archives do not fully clarify, the authorities opted not to press the matter further. It was in this atmosphere of isolation and paranoia that Harold Blackwood, the middle son of Elijah and father of Jeremiah, grew up. Documents recovered during the 1997 investigation reveal that Harold married his own second cousin, Rebecca DeGree, who lived in Idaho. The wedding was registered in Boise in 1952, but Rebecca was never seen by the Oak Ridge community. Harold just showed up one day with a wife, recalled Eleanor Wilson, a former local mail carrier, in her 93-year-old testimony. "We never truly saw her, you know. She was always in the car, even in summer, wearing a veil and a wide-brimmed hat." Letters addressed to her from Idaho ceased arriving after a couple of years. Medical records found on the property indicate that Rebecca gave birth to 6 children between 1953 and 1962, all delivered at home without professional medical help. Only 3 survived past childhood: Jeremiah, born 1956, Mary, 1958, and Joseph, 1961. The other 3 infants died from congenital complications, according to notes Harold made in a notebook serving as an improvised family medical record. A chilling entry in this notebook, dated 1962, hints at the moment the ideology of genetic isolation began to solidify: "Rebecca is too weak for more children. But we don't need strangers. We have our own pure blood, which is strong as steel when kept unmixed. The weak perish so the strong can flourish. This is nature's law that city men have forgotten." Upon Harold's death in 1978 from a tractor accident, Jeremiah, then 22, assumed control of both the family and the property. Tax records from that era show the family had enlarged the main house and constructed 2 additional structures, one of which was the barn that would become the epicenter of the horror uncovered almost 2 decades later. Under Jeremiah's leadership, the family's isolation intensified. While his father had maintained minimal contact with the city for necessary purchases, Jeremiah reduced these interactions to virtually zero. Agricultural supply store records show the last Blackwood purchase was made in 1983, when Jeremiah acquired substantial amounts of construction materials, tools, and seeds, enough to support a prolonged period of total isolation. The shift from simple social isolation to a deliberate genetic purification project was the most disturbing revelation from the diary seized in 1997. Jeremiah, who apparently developed a self-taught interest in genetics from books found on the property, began systematically documenting the family's physical characteristics and planning unions between relatives. "The outside world corrupts the blood," he wrote in a 1985 entry. "Each generation that remains pure strengthens our being. The weak will die, the strong will prosper. In 5 generations, we will have created something the world has never seen. The Red Barn and its inhabitants." The Red Barn, constructed in 1980 according to records, was designed from the outset not as an agricultural structure but as a lockdown space. Detailed, hand-drawn plans by Jeremiah showed a 2-story building with internal partitions, a rudimentary water system, and, most disturbingly, an elaborate system of locks that could only be opened from the outside. The 7 women rescued in 1997 lived in conditions the police reports described as medieval. The ground floor of the barn held a central common area with rustic benches, a long wooden table, and a wood stove that provided minimal heat during the harsh Oregon winters. The second floor was partitioned into small cubicles serving as individual dormitories, each containing a straw mattress and a bucket for waste. There was no proper plumbing. There was no electricity, the social services report noted. Water was provided by a gutter system that collected rainwater in barrels. During dry spells, Jeremiah or his brother Joseph apparently brought water from a nearby well. The barn's windows were boarded up and covered, allowing light only through small cracks and a few translucent roof tiles. Psychologists who evaluated the victims concluded this was a calculated method of temporal disorientation. The women had only a vague sense of time, relying on the limited natural light that penetrated these openings. The case grew more unsettling when Sarah, the oldest rescued woman at 42, began speaking to investigators. Sarah was identified as the biological daughter of Jeremiah and his own sister, Mary. She had been the first to be confined to the barn at the age of 15. "Daddy told us we were special, that our blood was purer than any families in America," Sarah stated in a recorded testimony now held in the FBI archives as part of its extreme case study program. "He had books on how breeders maintain pure strains. He said we were doing the same thing, only better." According to Sarah's testimony and the seized diaries, the family system was methodical. Girls were moved to the barn soon after reaching puberty. They were regularly visited by Jeremiah or Joseph in a documented rotation system recorded in notebooks found in the main house. These visits frequently resulted in pregnancies, although many ended in stillbirths or miscarriages. Weak babies did not survive, and this was considered natural, even desirable, explained Dr. Robert Peterson, the forensic psychiatrist assigned to the case. Male children who survived were eventually taken to the main house for training, while girls remained in the barn with their mothers, perpetuating the cycle. The women's daily routine, reconstructed by investigators, centered on simple activities, cultivating a small adjacent garden, where they were permitted brief, supervised periods, cleaning the confined space, sewing, and preparing basic meals. Ironically, this garden was their only source of beauty, with various flower species planted among the vegetables, creating a surreal contrast to their dark existence. Makeshift medical records kept by Jeremiah revealed a disturbingly clinical coldness. Each woman had a chart detailing her pregnancy history, physical traits, and, most disturbingly, her reproductive value, classified on a scale of 1 to 10. The food provided was surprisingly nutritious, albeit monotonous, mainly eggs, milk, and vegetables cultivated on the property, with occasional meat. "It wasn't a typical case of nutritional deprivation," said nutritionist Elizabeth Dawson in her report. On the contrary, there was an almost obsessive focus on specific nutrients. "We found herbal home supplements, apparently formulated to strengthen the blood, as described in Jeremiah's notebooks." Communication with the outside world was non-existent. The women had no access to newspapers, radios, or any other information source. Their knowledge was limited to what they taught each other and the few books allowed in the barn, primarily practical manuals on home medicine and agriculture, along with a disturbing, altered Bible from which Jeremiah had removed passages and added his own texts. One of the most unsettling discoveries was the notebooks of Emma, the second oldest woman at 37. Hidden under her mattress, they contained detailed drawings of what she imagined the outside world to be, based only on the few available books and the stories told by older women. Her illustrations of modern cities resembled 19th-century drawings, revealing the profound informational isolation they endured. They developed their own communication system, explained Dr. Linda Morris, the linguist who analyzed the women's interactions after the rescue. "It wasn't a new language, exactly, but they used common words with highly specific meanings that only they understood. For instance, they called the sun the vigilante and had dozens of distinct terms to describe the barn sounds during storms. When questioned about escape attempts or resistance, the women exhibited a conditioned fear response. "Where would we have gone?" asked Lily, then 23, during a therapy session. "Daddy said the outside world was full of radiation, that people were deformed and sick." She continued, "He told us we were the only healthy people remaining, and one day, when it was safe, we would leave and repopulate the earth." This apocalyptic mythology, created by Jeremiah to justify the isolation, had been developed over decades, incorporating and distorting elements of real news, such as references to the AIDS epidemic, the Chernobyl nuclear accident, and other global events he presented as signs of impending civilizational collapse. Genetic and psychological impact. When the 7 women were finally examined at the University Medical Center of Oregon, doctors confirmed the profound physical consequences of generations of endogamy. The medical report, later published anonymously in the American Journal of Medical Genetics, detailed a range of conditions rarely seen together in such concentration. The pattern of anomalies observed suggests severe and sustained consanguinity across multiple generations, wrote Dr. James Richardson, the study's lead geneticist. We are witnessing the expression of numerous rare recessive genes that would typically remain dormant in populations with greater genetic diversity. Among the most obvious conditions was polydactyly, extra fingers or toes, present in 5 of the 7 women, and severe dental malformations, including microdontia, abnormally small teeth, and oligodontia, congenital absence of multiple teeth. 4 of the women had heterochromia, each eye being a different color, a trait Jeremiah apparently valued and had attempted to select for, according to his diaries. More worrisome were the internal conditions. Imaging studies revealed heart malformations in all the women, ranging from minor septal defects to more serious conditions like tetralogy of Fallot, present in 2 of them. The most critical case was Rose, 19, whose medical report stated she presented a combination of conditions we would rarely see together in a single patient: craniosynosis, premature fusion of skull bones resulting in severe facial deformity, achondroplasia, a form of dwarfism, and a severe immunological deficiency that made her extremely vulnerable to infections. Her survival to this age without medical intervention is remarkable. One of the younger women, April, 14, suffered from phenylketonuria, a rare metabolic disorder that had not been properly treated, causing irreversible neurological damage. The psychological and cognitive impact was equally deep. Neuropsychological testing revealed that 5 of the 7 women had some degree of intellectual disability, though it was challenging to determine how much was attributable to genetic factors versus extreme sensory and educational deprivation. Sarah's case is particularly fascinating, said neuropsychologist Dr. Patricia Winters. Despite the extreme isolation, she showed above-average cognitive capacity. She taught herself to read using the few available books and later taught the others. She even devised a complex system of time counting based on the light patterns entering the roof cracks. DNA tests using then state-of-the-art technology confirmed the physical symptoms. The endogamy coefficient of some of the youngest individuals reached levels rarely documented in modern medical literature. Simply put, explained Dr. Richardson in a 1999 interview with Scientific American, the DNA of these women contained long, identical segments on both chromosomes. This only occurs when the same genes are inherited from both parents who, in turn, share very close common ancestors. In general populations, we see small segments like this, reflecting a distant common ancestry. But in this case, up to 37% of the genome of some younger women consisted of these identical segments, numbers only found in cases of extreme population isolation. Perhaps the most disturbing finding was the documentation recovered from the main house. In a locked office, investigators found dozens of notebooks in which Jeremiah had meticulously recorded his observations over the decades. These diaries revealed that the patriarch was fully aware of the genetic risks but viewed them as a necessary step in a purification process. The first generations must suffer so that the future can transcend, he wrote in a 1992 entry. The ancient Egyptians understood this. The pharaohs married their sisters for divine, not worldly, reasons. The weak are naturally eliminated. The strong survive and become stronger. In 10 more generations, we will have created a superior lineage. This distortion of basic scientific knowledge to justify extreme abuse reflected a toxic mix of paranoia, isolation, and pathological narcissism. Jeremiah had constructed an elaborate belief system that combined poorly interpreted genetics, decontextualized religious references, and conspiracy theories about the genetic degeneration of modern society and racial purity. Among the books found were early 20th century texts on eugenics, treatises on animal husbandry, and, surprisingly, several recent academic books on population genetics, suggesting Jeremiah occasionally acquired updated materials, perhaps through correspondence requests. He was not an uneducated man, stated Dr. Peterson in his psychological assessment. He demonstrated considerable intelligence, but it was severely warped by isolation, possible untreated mental illness, and a selective exposure to information that reinforced his existing beliefs. It's a classic example of how knowledge, when divorced from adequate ethical supervision or social context, can be dangerously misapplied. Conclusion and legacy. The morning of October 21, 1997, marked a new beginning for the 7 women of the Blackwood Barn. Following 4 days of preliminary medical assessments, they were moved to a specialized facility in Portland. There, a multidisciplinary team of doctors, special educators, social workers, and psychologists began what would become one of the most complex rehabilitation processes ever documented in the United States. The legal fate of Jeremiah and Joseph Blackwood followed a parallel trajectory. Both were arrested on the day of the barn's discovery and, after extensive psychiatric evaluations, were deemed fit to stand trial. In September 1998, following a 3-week trial that garnered national attention, Jeremiah was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for multiple counts of incest, child abuse, rape, and kidnapping. Joseph, whom prosecutors argued had acted under his older brother's psychological coercion, received a 45-year sentence. This is not merely a case of extreme abuse, declared Judge Elena Hayes during the sentencing. It is a case of the deliberate and systematic perversion of fundamental human principles, extending over decades and affecting multiple generations. The court rarely encounters circumstances where a defendant's social reintegration is deemed fundamentally impossible, but this is one of those cases. Jeremiah remained emotionless throughout the trial, refusing to acknowledge the court's legitimacy. His single statement, made during the sentencing phase, exposed the depth of his distorted belief. "You fail to understand what you destroyed. It was not cruelty, but directed evolution. It was not a prison, it was a sanctuary. In 100 years, when your lineages are sick and weak, the world will regret what was lost here." Joseph, conversely, showed progressive signs of grasping the severity of his actions. In a letter to the court before sentencing, he wrote, "I grew up believing the world was exactly as Jeremiah described it. I never knew any other reality. This doesn't justify what I did, but perhaps it explains how a person can become an accomplice to something so horrible without fully recognizing its horror." The reintegration process for the 7 women was lengthy and complicated. The special program developed for them by the University of Oregon, later dubbed the Blackwood Protocol, became a template for extreme rescue cases involving victims of prolonged isolation. "We couldn't simply throw them into the modern world," explained Dr. Catherine Morris, the program coordinator. "Everything, from the constant noise of a city to basic concepts like the internet, television, or electricity, was completely alien to them. We had to create a transitional setting where they could be gradually exposed to aspects of modern life, always with intense psychological support." The case took on a new dimension in 2001 when Sarah Blackwood, the oldest survivor, published her memoir with Dr. Morris's assistance. Born in Darkness, Memories of the Blackwood Barn became an instant bestseller and was later adapted into an award-winning HBO documentary. The proceeds were deposited into a fiduciary fund to support the continued education and treatment of all the survivors. "We are not just victims," Sarah wrote in the book's epilogue. "We are survivors, and now, finally, we are people entitled to our own futures. The story of the barn is over, but our individual stories are just beginning." The impact of the Blackwood case extended far beyond the people directly involved. In 2003, the U.S. Congress passed Sarah's Law, which established new protocols for monitoring children in home education in isolated rural areas. The law also created special funds for training professionals in rural communities to identify signs of extreme family abuse. In the scientific community, the anonymous medical data collected from the Blackwood women, always with their informed consent, contributed significantly to understanding the effects of severe consanguinity on humans. A longitudinal study, still underway at the University of Washington, continues to monitor the psychological, medical, and genetic aspects of the case, generating dozens of scientific publications that have helped improve treatments for various rare genetic conditions. In 2015, 18 years after the rescue, the Blackwood property was finally acquired by the state of Oregon and demolished. A small memorial was erected where the barn once stood, a simple bronze plaque bearing the words, "To honor the resilience of the human spirit in the face of extreme cruelty." to remember that community surveillance should never be supplanted by isolation. Of the 7 women rescued, 5 eventually succeeded in establishing independent lives, though they require varying degrees of ongoing support. April and Rose, the most severely impacted by their genetic conditions, remain under specialized care. Sarah, the oldest, became a respected activist for the rights of abuse victims and a symbol of resilience. In her 2010 speech at the National Conference on Child Abuse, she offered a powerful perspective. People often ask me how I survived those years in the barn. The truth is, I survived because I never knew an alternative existed. Now I know there was an entire world beyond those walls. My mission is to ensure that no child ever grows up without knowing that they're entitled to this world. The legacy of the Blackwood case remains a dark reminder of the extremes of human isolation and the abuse that can flourish when communities lose touch with their most isolated members. It also stands as a testament to the extraordinary human capacity for adaptation and recovery, even after experiences that challenge the limits of comprehension.